Welcome to this explainer. Today we're going to navigate one of the most intense, absolute, and frankly severe theological concepts found in the biblical text, the Hebrew concept of Karet. We're going to examine the dialectical tension between the irreversible, permanent cutting off in the Old Covenant and how that ultimately collides with the dynamic, restorative grace of the New Covenant. Let's apply a really rigorous, forensic lens to see exactly how a permanent spiritual death sentence actually laid the conceptual groundwork for messianic restoration. It's a fascinating journey, so let's dive right in.
Here is our roadmap for the analysis. We'll start with the absolute nature of Karet, move into the specific triggers of this divine excision, and then look at the jurisdictional split between human courts and heaven. From there, we'll explore the invisible covenantal status it creates before breaking down the massive new covenant shift and finally resolving it all with messianic authority and restoration.
Section 1. The absolute nature of Karet. To really understand the gravity of our topic, we have to start by defining our primary term. The Hebrew word karet literally translates to being cut off, but in the context of the biblical legal code, it signifies something much deeper. It is an irrevocable severance of the individual soul or their standing from the covenantal body. We have to be clear here. This isn't just a temporary timeout. It's not a religious suspension where you sit on the bench for a few weeks. To put it in modern terms, imagine this as a permanent, unappealable deletion of your spiritual DNA. It is an absolute total loss of your covenantal citizenship. When an individual incurred Karet, a massive ontological shift actually occurred. Their very state of being, in relation to the divine, was fundamentally altered at the root level. As we're going to see, this is vastly different from ritual impurities. Ritual impurity was super common, right? It was easily fixed with a specific wash or a short waiting period. Karet, on the other hand, was a terminal spiritual condition.
This is where the absolute finality of the law comes into play. According to Gemini, under the strict exegesis of the Mosaic Code, there is no procedural or ritual mechanism provided for the restoration of an individual who has incurred the status of Karet, as the text characterizes the state as a definitive, divine excision from the covenantal community. Think about that for a second. The Torah is famous for its incredibly exhaustive lists of rules. It has laws for literally everything, from how to treat mildew in the walls of your house to exactly what happens if your ox happens to gore your neighbor's property. It comes complete with highly detailed, step-by-step pathways for restitution. If you commit an unintentional sin, there is a specific offering you bring. If you become ritually impure, there is a highly specific washing protocol. But for Karet, absolute deafening silence. The legal corpus contains 0 ordinances, 0 sacrifices, and 0 judicial paths to rejoin the covenant once this line is crossed. It prescribes a strict judgment of excision, not a process of reconciliation.
Section 2. Triggers of divine excision. So what actually causes this? In the Mosaic legal framework, Karet is the strictly mandated consequence for deliberate, high-handed violations of the covenant. We can group these infractions into 3 primary categories: ritual infractions, sexual immorality, and acts of defiance. Ritual infractions include things that seem foundational to the covenant itself, like a male failing to be circumcised, eating leavened bread on Passover, or deliberately violating the Sabbath. The second category, sexual immorality, covers forbidden unions, incest, and adultery. These are actions that the text vividly describes as polluting the land and deeply defiling the sanctity of the family unit. Finally, acts of defiance. This involves things like idolatry, consulting the occult, and outright blasphemy against the name of YHVH. Now, what actually unites all of these disparate categories? It's the concept of biad rama, a Hebrew phrase that means sinning with a high hand. These aren't oops moments. These aren't accidents. These are profoundly presumptuous sins. The individual is essentially looking the divine law square in the eye, fully knowing what they are doing, and actively, intentionally breaking it. This deliberate, brazen defiance is exactly what fundamentally ruptures the relationship with the divine, and that's what triggers this ultimate penalty.
As Gemini clearly notes regarding this intent, Karet is strictly applied to intentional violations. If the action is performed in error, the remedy is a sin offering, which prevents the status of Karet from being triggered. This distinction is absolutely vital. The difference between intentional rebellion and unintentional sin, which is known in Hebrew as Be'shagaga, changes everything. You have to understand that the elaborate sacrificial system of ancient Israel functioned as a vast, gracious safety net. But that safety net was exclusively designed to catch human error, ignorance, and weakness. It offered absolutely 0 protection for defiant, willful rebellion. If you made a genuine mistake or acted out of ignorance, the altar was right there waiting for you. But if you raised your hand in deliberate defiance, you bypassed that altar entirely. You fell straight through the net, right into the jurisdiction of divine excision.
Section 3. Human courts versus heaven.
So who exactly enforces this? Let's look at how jurisdiction was strictly divided. In Jewish law, there is a very stark, very clear boundary between what human courts can actually enforce and what belongs exclusively to the divine. A human court, known as the Beit Din, handles matat beit din, which is the judicial death penalty. However, to actually execute a criminal, a human court requires incredibly strict, almost impossibly high evidentiary protocols. You absolutely need 2 valid witnesses, you need a formal warning given right before the act is committed, and the defendant must verbally acknowledge that warning. It's a massive legal bar specifically designed to address crimes that pose a direct, visible, public threat to the community. But Karet is administered solely by God, or what's often called the hand of heaven. A human court has zero jurisdiction to impose Karet. You can sort of think of it like the difference between a local civil penalty administered by a county judge versus a massive federal deportation order that only the absolute sovereign ruler of a nation can issue. Because Karet addresses spiritual crimes that very often occur in total privacy, completely without witnesses, the administration of that penalty is removed from human hands entirely.
Now, even though Karet is a divine verdict handled by heaven, we do occasionally see partial physical manifestations of it in the biblical narrative. This is captured by the Hebrew word gazar, which refers to an observable act of separation. A really prime example of this is King Uzziah. Uzziah proudly usurped the role of the priests in the temple, which was a massively high-handed act of defiance. The text tells us he was instantly struck with leprosy and was cut off, or gazar, from the house of the Lord. He literally lived the rest of his life in a separate, isolated house. This was a highly visible, physical demonstration of his internal spiritual verdict. He didn't just drop dead instantly on the temple floor. Instead, his covenantal status and his access to the presence of God were immediately and permanently terminated. The internal reality of Karet was made visible through gazar.
Section 4. The invisible covenantal status.
This brings us to a really fascinating social reality. Gemini points out, because Karet is a divine judgment without a human legal verdict, the community often would not know definitively who was correct and who was not. This is incredibly important to grasp. Unlike a physical ailment like leprosy, which had very explicit quarantine rules commanding the individual to live outside the camp, there was no mandated social boycott for someone under Karet. Why? Because the community usually couldn't even see it. If someone committed a Karet-worthy sin in total secret, there were no witnesses, there was no court record, there was no public trial. That individual might live right there among the people, appearing totally normal to everyone else, while functionally existing as a spiritual ghost. They were already excised from God's promises, simply waiting for the divine consequence, like premature death or childlessness, to naturally manifest over time. It was a terrifyingly invisible state.
Let's look at how this builds into the New Testament, because it perfectly reconciles with Jesus' instructions in Matthew chapter 18. In Matthew 18, Jesus famously says that if a brother sins and refuses to listen to witnesses or the congregation, you are to treat him as a Gentile. Now, a lot of people mistake this for the sudden invention of church excommunication, but forensically, it's deeply tied to the Old Covenant framework we've just been discussing. When we look at private Karet on the left, we see an invisible internal condition where the community simply cannot act. God handles the judgment alone. Contrast this with public unrepentance on the right. Jesus is actually utilizing the strict Torah requirement of 2 or 3 witnesses to make a private, high-handed rebellion public. When the church treats someone as a Gentile, which in a first-century context literally meant an outsider to the covenant, they are not generating a new spiritual curse out of thin air. The community is simply acting as a judicial body to formally recognize that the individual has already, through their high-handed rebellion, functionally severed themselves from the covenant. It is a communal social recognition of a pre-existing spiritual reality.
So this brings us to the ultimate question. How exactly does the absolute irreversibility of Karet in the Old Covenant reconcile with the reversibility introduced by the apostles in the New Covenant? If the Torah provided absolutely zero mechanism to reverse divine excision, how do New Testament writers suddenly start talking about being brought back in? Let's bridge this dialectical gap.
Section 5. The New Covenant Shift. The crucial point here is understanding the massive shift from a static law to a dynamic, relational structure. Under the Torah framework on the left, we have a completely static legal system. The penalty is basically binary. You are either in the covenant by birth, or you commit high-handed rebellion and you are excised permanently. You couldn't just reconvert to being an Israelite because membership was entirely genealogical.
You never stopped being an Israelite physically, you were just spiritually severed with absolutely no legal path back. It's static. But when we look at the Pauline framework found in Romans 11, Paul introduces his famous olive tree metaphor. He acknowledges that some natural branches, referring to unbelieving Israel, have indeed been broken off due to their unbelief. This is a real-time, present-tense cutting off. It mirrors Karet. However, Paul introduces a radical new mechanism, reversibility. He explicitly states they can actually be grafted in again if they abandon their unbelief. The entire structure has shifted from a static, rigid legal code to a dynamic, faith-based architecture where a severed branch can literally be miraculously reattached.
To really anchor the academic weight of this synthesis, we turn again to our source material. Gemini states, "The transition you identified marks a shift from a static legal framework to an eschatological framework." Paul effectively reopens the question of the cut-off status by asserting that the olive root remains active, providing a channel for regrafting that was not codified in the original Mosaic statutes. When we say eschatological, we mean focusing on God's ultimate future endgame. Because the root of the tree, the original Abrahamic promise, remains vital and active, it provides a channel for grace that simply did not exist anywhere in the rigid legal statutes of Moses. The question of permanent exile, which the Torah considered closed forever, has suddenly been reopened.
Section 6. Messianic Authority and Restoration.
This is where all the forensic pieces finally connect for us. The entire structure of the covenant underwent a profound systemic transformation. Under the old Mosaic covenant, membership was based purely on genealogy and national origin. It was a nation-state model. Because of this, as we've established ad nauseum, there was zero mechanism for return codified in the law for a high-handed sin. Restoration was strictly and legally forbidden. But the new covenant is radically different. It is a voluntary, faith-based assembly. Because membership is voluntary and relational rather than genealogical, the mechanism for return suddenly becomes possible through repentance, or what the Greek calls metanoia, and public confession. The community completely transitions from being passive observers of hidden sin, unable to act, to active stewards of grace, literally commanded to restore the repentant through messianic grace.
And this brings us to the ultimate synthesis. According to Gemini, the reversibility is not a change in the law's requirements, but a change in the administrator of the covenant. This is the absolute key to the entire puzzle. The law didn't suddenly change its mind. The absolute finality of Karet was 100% legally sound. Rather, the king, the Messiah, exercised his sovereign royal prerogative to override the law's finality. Think of it like a corporate takeover. The company rules didn't magically change to create a loophole out of nowhere. Rather, a brand new CEO stepped in and exercised sovereign executive prerogative to pardon the offense. In the new covenant, Jesus acts as both the ultimate high priest and the king. The restoration of a cut-off soul isn't some clever legal loophole, it is a direct act of sovereign mercy by the new administrator of the covenant.
So, to summarize this profound messianic resolution, the covenant is no longer defined by bloodline or national origin. It is defined entirely by the reign of the Messiah. Therefore, restoration is no longer bound by the terrifying rigid silence of the Torah. It is now an active expression of the king exercising his sovereign prerogative to forgive. Consequently, the role of the community is completely redefined. The assembly is now the guardian of a voluntary fellowship. They have the derived authority to not only recognize when someone has severed themselves through unrepentance, but infinitely more importantly, they are authorized to actively recognize their repentance and welcome them completely back into the fold. As we wrap up this incredibly deep forensic study, I want to leave you with a lingering, provocative thought. If the absolute, terrifying finality of the ancient law has truly been superseded by the sovereign prerogative of messianic grace, how does this redefine our understanding of permanent spiritual exile versus restorative discipline today? It forces us to ask whether we view our own communities and our own failings through the lens of a static, unyielding law or through the dynamic, restorative, and shocking power of grace. Thanks for joining me for this explainer.